Okay, then I think I'm going to welcome everyone to the Young Dementia Network Tea Time webinar, Financial Security. I'm Tessa Guttridge and I'm chair of the network. And before I hand over to Calum and Kenny, I would just like to remind attendees that whilst we can't see or hear you, we absolutely do want you to participate in the webinar. If you want to use the chat very freely, please do, and of course put your questions into the Q&A tool as well. I think that's probably all I need to say, apart from let's have a really good hour. Calum and Kenny, handing over to you now.
Thanks, Tessa, and thanks very much to the Young Dementia Network for having me along to today's webinar. A little bit about me before we kick off. My interest in this topic is both professional and personal. Professionally, I'm a lawyer specialising in financial misconduct. I started off at a big law firm in the city working on financial disputes and investigations before moving to the Bank of England a few years ago. And for the last couple of years, I've worked in the enforcement division of the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the main body that regulates financial services in the UK. And my work there involves everything from money laundering investigations through to dealing with dodgy pensions advisors. But personally, and the main reason I'm here today, is that 8 years ago, my mum, Anne Macdonald, was diagnosed with a rare form of early onset dementia called posterior cortical atrophy when she was just 55. We were very fortunate as a family to have myself, a financial services lawyer, and my sister, a doctor, to deal with some of the challenges and obstacles that a dementia diagnosis inevitably raises. But I was still amazed by the number of challenges and issues we faced. And I was conscious that not everyone was as fortunate as we were. So that really ignited my interest in this particular area. And particularly in my professional work, I've seen how much of a challenge and a minefield financial issues and disputes can be for absolutely everyone, not least people who are dealing with a dementia diagnosis, either themselves or on behalf of a loved one or person they care for. So before I kick off, and being a proper lawyer, I did just want to mention, should make clear that nothing in today's webinar is going to be financial or investment advice, either on behalf of myself, Kenny, who I'll introduce in just a moment, or the network. And I'm very much talking from personal experience over the last 10 years or so, rather than official FCA advice. The other thing I'd like to say is I'm very much aware that everyone's dementia experience and diagnosis and what that means is very different, and there's an awful lot of different issues raised. So during the course of today's webinar, in addition to questions, it'd be absolutely fantastic if you can share any anecdotes or experiences you've had, and in particular, any tips, tricks, or advice you'd like to share with other members of the webinar. And that will help me make sure we get a really representative experience today. Now, before I run through the three main topics of today's webinar, I'm delighted to introduce to you today Kenny Moffat, who is a member of the Scottish Dementia Working Group, and I think is going to introduce himself and give a bit of background and help set today's webinar on financial security in context. I won't give him more of an introduction because I don't want to take away any of his thunder, but Kenny, thank you very much for joining us today. And would you be able to give us a bit of your background?
Indeed, Calum, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to attend this afternoon. As my colleagues in the Scottish Working Group would tell you, I have no difficulty in sharing my experience of talking publicly. I'm 55 years old. I was diagnosed in 2015 with mild cognitive impairment, and later, a year later, that changed to a diagnosis of young onset vascular dementia. A week after that, I took a heart attack and a stroke, which put me in hospital for a period of weeks. and I was off work for 6 months. Because of the diagnosis and because of my mobility issues, I wasn't allowed to drive. I did return to work through a phased return, but that didn't work very well. Because I couldn't drive, I had to pull staff from their duties to transport me. I was the chief executive of a major charity, managing a budget of 2.7 million per year. And the board of trustees of the charity weren't happy that I was pulling staff from their duties to transport me about North Lanarkshire. And eventually we came to a fairly amicable, I think we could say, agreement that I would leave through retirement, which meant I went from a 4-figure monthly salary to PIP. Our household income was decimated. I'm not married, I'm single. I am in a same-sex relationship, a civil partnership, which disqualifies you from many of the benefits that a married couple would be entitled to. The carers allowance in Scotland was not available to my partner. I am an only child of 2 only children, so my family network is limited. Family get-togethers can be quite predictable. The only thing I would say, without sounding too frivolous, is I don't have to remember a lot of names at Christmas. It's the biggest impact for me is that I'm not allowed to be a power of attorney for my parents. We've lost my father in the past year, not COVID related, but my mother has advanced Parkinson's with associated dementia, and I can't be her power of attorney. My partner is her power of attorney. That was her choice. But he's also my power of attorney, and is uncomfortable in having to adopt that role for 2 people who are related, given that I will inherit my mother's estate. In terms of finance, as I say, I went from a fairly healthy monthly salary to benefits. We are homeowners. We at the time had a mortgage. Thankfully, I was in a good pension and was able to access that because I was retiring on medical grounds. I could access a lump sum, which allowed us to pay off the vast bulk of the mortgage, which is now completely paid off. But that also impacted on my partner's capacity to earn and go back to work. In Scotland, we have a system which is called self-directed support, which is a budget that you access through your local authority to allow you to employ a personal assistant for the person who needs cared for, myself. We did that. It was a struggle getting there, but we got there eventually. And we now employ, through a third-party organisation who deal with payroll, a full-time personal assistant for myself, which allows my partner to go back to work. However, that also means he's paying full tax. The Scottish Government paid £500 to all unpaid carers recently. He got that through his salary and was fully taxed on it. And as a result, our universal credit claim was reduced significantly by about 90% for a month, which took us from about £600 to £6 for a month. So everybody's journey is very different. My own journey has been difficult, not only because of the condition. I'm very fortunate to have been a member of the working group. We've been meeting virtually for over a year now on a regular basis. In fact, I was on a meeting this afternoon with my colleagues before joining this webinar. But that's a bit of background about myself. I don't know if you've got any specific questions, Calum, that you want to ask me.
I'll just unmute myself, sorry. No, Kenny, thank you. That's incredibly helpful. I wondered if, in terms of a starting off question, one of the topics, the kind of the three main topics we mentioned today is planning and the things that arise immediately after a diagnosis. And I wonder if there's any things you now know which you wish you'd known sooner, or any sorts of pieces of advice you'd pass on to anyone else who's slightly earlier in the journey than you are.
The main thing for me is power of attorney. Because I had to access my pension in its entirety, I no longer have a pension, so I don't have a long-term plan. I'm obviously not paying into a pension because I'm not working. My partner is, but that's not going to be sufficient. If I have to ever move into residential care, I'll have to sell my home. Because I wouldn't be entitled to free residential care under the Scottish Government's legislation or the local authority legislation in North Lanarkshire. So the planning and thinking ahead, which, given the diagnosis, are not always straightforward, is important. And talking things through with somebody who understands your predicament and understands the diagnosis that you have is very important.
Thanks, Kenny. The second question I had is, and this is sort of the second topic we will look at in a bit more detail today, is around problem solving and what to do when you encounter issues or difficulties with companies or banks or financial institutions. I was just wondering if you'd had any obstacles or challenges, particularly in the sort of the kind of financial services or finance area following your diagnosis.
I've not had any specific issues, I'm glad to say, other than dealing with the local authority. I had to involve a local advocate and not a legal advocate, but somebody working for a voluntary sector advocacy organisation and my local elected councillor to assist me to navigate through the difficulties around accessing the budget for self-directed support. That was a major barrier. The local authority weren't keen to distribute a budget because in doing so, they were moving funds away from direct local social work services. And that was seen to be a risk. Well, I've got to say, dealing with banks, whether it be on the phone or in person when we were allowed to go into the bank, I have a card that I simply pass to the teller that explains my condition and who's with me. Who's usually my personal assistant or my carer. And I've never had any issue. People are always very thoughtful, considerate, and understanding.
That's a really useful bit of advice. Was that a card that was provided to you, or did you make that up yourself?
It was provided by the local post-diagnostic support service, the part of the NHS Lanarkshire Young Onset Dementia support team. The nurse, my dementia nurse, gave me that when she introduced me to Alzheimer's Scotland, which was the best thing that she ever did.
Excellent. Thanks, Kenny. Thank you very much, Kenny. I think we're going to move on to a few of those topics in a little bit more detail. And I think, Kenny, if it's all right with you, I might come back to you to ask a couple more questions later in the webinar.
Yes, indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, Catherine, if you're able to take us on to the next slide. As mentioned, today's topic is financial issues affecting people with young onset dementia and their families and carers. There are a huge number of issues to think about here, and I think Kenny's done an excellent job in kind of summarising a lot of the key initial ones that come up. I've tried to distill most of them under three headings, which is planning, problem solving, and protecting. Planning will cover quite briefly, as I think Kenny's already flagged up quite a few of the issues you want to start thinking about from an early stage. But obviously a talk about financial issues and dementia wouldn't be complete without at least mentioning them. The second topic is a bit about problem solving, whether it's financial services specifically or other types of significant expenditure, for example, renovation or home adjustments that you might need to make post-diagnosis. You or your loved one, as I've seen, can frequently run into challenges or obstacles from the company or companies you deal with. So under this topic, we'll cover just some pointers around how to resolve disputes and difficulties as efficiently and hopefully painlessly as possible. And finally, the last topic is about protecting yourself and loved ones from everything from financial scams to being missold products you don't need, or receiving and falling victim to unsolicited offers or pressure selling. And I know, particularly having just chatted to Tessa and Catherine from the network beforehand, that the issue of scams is, you know, not just for the wider population at the moment, but particularly relevant for those with early onset and indeed all forms of dementia. So we'll try to spend a bit of time on that one. Catherine, can we pop on to the next slide, please? Thank you. As mentioned, a diagnosis of young onset dementia is going to raise a huge number of issues beyond the kind of typically affected age group. Kenny's already mentioned the issues, or some of the issues that can crop up initially around work. And I think kind of in terms of signposting you to useful resources around planning, I think Dementia UK's own guide on this topic is particularly helpful. But the key thing to emphasise here is that under the Equality Act, you know, dementia is, you know, a recognised disability, and you absolutely do have rights here. And if you are still employed, you know, it is incumbent on your employer to try to make reasonable adjustments and to enter into a dialogue with you. Obviously, there will need to be longer term considerations about when and how much work it's practical to keep engaging in. But, you know, the key point there is that it's not that a diagnosis of dementia means, you know, you have to immediately or could be pressured into immediately leaving your job, especially if that's not something you wish to do. As Kenny mentioned, the other key thing from an early stage is really taking a look at your financial obligations overall. And that's both in terms of outgoings, for example, if you still have part of a mortgage outstanding, and as well as income inflows. So, for example, it is incredibly important, as Kenny's mentioned, to ensure that from an early stage you're claiming, you know, all the benefits you're entitled to. And both Dementia UK and Alzheimer's Society have some quite helpful calculators and resources available to help you make sure you are claiming everything you're entitled to. I should also mention, by the way, I will flag quite a few resources as we go through the few slides today. We're conscious that if we put links in the webinar itself, you wouldn't be able to click on them. But rest assured, we will be sending you a list of the resources and links we mention afterwards. So don't worry if you're not able to write them all down at the time. They will be included in the follow-up letter. Kenny's also mentioned the cost of care, and it's important there to flag that the Scottish system is slightly different from the system in England and Wales, and indeed the one in Northern Ireland. The critical point, of course, here is that social care is means tested generally in England and Wales, whereas NHS care for a primary healthcare need is not. And often quite where a primary healthcare need kicks in is quite unclear, particularly that seems to be something which local authorities can struggle with dementia, and in particular an early onset dementia diagnosis. In terms of financial advice and resources on this area, you might decide that given everything you've got on your plate, it may make sense to get some professional advice. A great starting point is often the online resources available from Dementia UK and Alzheimer's Society. There are, however, specialist advisors, given the complexity of this area, particularly, for example, if you have if you have property to consider, there are specialist fees advisors available. And obviously, I can't say if that's right for every individual in every given circumstance. And these specialists will charge fees, and it's important you understand exactly what those will be up front and use a reputable advisor that's authorized by the Financial Conduct Authority. But you may find that this is a time in your life, either for you or a loved one, that it is a good point to seek some specialist advice to help you plan and budget. A couple of really good starting resources in terms of financial planning and pointing you in the direction of reputable financial advisors are payingforcare.org and Money Helper. I'll be mentioning Money Helper a couple of times in today's slides because it's a particularly useful online resource covered by the government. Now, Kenny's also mentioned powers of attorney, and I agree with him that that's an absolutely vital tool in planning early on. Those are, of course, the legal documents which gives someone else the ability to act on your behalf, either in terms of health and welfare or, more relevant for today's conversation, your property and finances. And I think the real key thing I just flag is I was in Alzheimer's Society last week, and they actually run an excellent specialist service which assists with preparing powers of attorney, because the forms are not always quite as simple to fill out as they first look. And as many of you might have discovered, you need to sign them in a precise order. So they offer a really useful service there if you haven't already got power of attorney in place. The other point I mentioned, having been talking to their power of attorney team recently, is that the official guidance on registering a power of attorney says it can take up to 20 weeks to register one. Now, historically, in practice, it actually often took a couple of months to formally register a power of attorney with the Office of the Public Guardian, which is the body that needs to approve it. Recently, I'm not sure if this is working from home or lockdown related, but it seems that's taking an awful lot longer. And anecdotally, it can be taking the Office of the Public Guardian up to 6 months to approve a power of attorney. So that's really just to flag that, 6 months can be quite a lot can change in 6 months. So if you are thinking about doing a power of attorney, I think the real thing to point out there is it's probably never too early to start getting those arrangements in place. The other points I mentioned there are, in terms of your financial arrangements, this is obviously a really important time, one, to just document your various different accounts and financial products you use, and think about simplifying. And that's certainly something I think we probably ideally would have done a little bit earlier with my mum Anne. Do you have multiple bank accounts or credit cards? And for example, do you need all of them? In terms of other sort of simplifying, are you actually going to, you may over the years have built up quite a significant credit limit. You can always ask a bank to reduce a credit limit as well as increasing it. And might that be helpful actually in future years? Are there amounts that you and your loved one agree that you're not likely to want to spend above typically, or would want to discuss? in which case, if you're using a debit account, are you able to set up standing orders and direct debits so that you don't need to keep a certain amount, above a certain amount of cash in that particular account, and actually you keep most of your money in notice accounts, which might help stop an accidental purchase. In addition, some banks and building societies still work on hard copy security tokens. Those are the keyrings which show you numbers in order to log into your online banking. You may decide that you or your loved one finds that particularly useful, but alternatively, there's a lot of banks now that allow you to do absolutely everything through a mobile phone app. And you might decide that that's a lot easier and simpler rather than having one more item that can potentially go missing. Finally, there's a lot of products which aren't entirely financial services, but all eat into your finances, which it may well be worth thinking about at this time or in the coming years if you're going to use quite as much. I know Dementia UK has done some quite high-profile work on the council tax discount. But that is to say, if you or a loved one have dementia, you will be normally eligible for a partial discount in council tax. But there are other products and services it may be worth checking if your status has changed for. So, for example, it might seem like a simple example, but following her diagnosis, my mum was out of the house quite a lot less. And so she'd generally be at home. If she did use her phone or the internet, would be on Wi-Fi. And it was only after a couple of years it actually occurred to us, with everything else that was going on, that actually she was using or signed up to a mobile phone data plan, which gave her an awful lot more than she actually needed. And overnight we were able to change her phone contract and actually save, I think, 20 or 25 pounds a month. Similarly, things like if you have a premium card with built-in travel insurance that you're using less now. These are all things to sit down, not all at once, of course, but have a think about and see if you can simplify the financial services and products that you're currently using. Catherine, can we pop on to the next slide? Yeah. So the second topic is problem solving and some of the issues and difficulties that you might run into. Again, these are not uniquely limited to financial services, but they very frequently arise in that context. So, for example, one of the most common problems we had was around the kind of classic data protections issues. So if my dad or I were trying to sort an issue for my mum, we'd get, or help her, we'd get the classic, well, you're not the named account holder, etc. And I think by and large, a lot of the large banks are getting better at dealing with this sort of stuff. And I should have mentioned slightly earlier, but in addition to powers of attorney, a lot of banks now have a specific part of their website where you can, or an email address, where you can register what they refer to as either a letter of authority or third-party access. And that allows a carer, a loved one, to access your bank account on their behalf. Normally for most banks, you can locate this by searching for your bank name and then their accessibility or disability hub. But that can be one quite useful way for cutting through data protection and account access issues without having to go straight to a power of attorney. The other key thing here to remember is that the data protection regulation is meant to work for you. There is a specific right in there that you have access to your data, and generally speaking, someone else, for example, a carer, can access it on your behalf. And that is one of your fundamental data rights. And the circumstances where a company can or should grant someone else access to your data that are most relevant to us today, well, unsurprisingly, if you've granted your consent for them to do so, But also there's other relevant factors the company or bank can take into account. So for example, is it information that your partner or carer knows about already? And are they trying to use it, to benefit you, and in the context of where you have an illness which may mean you require assistance? I'm mentioning all these factors not just to try and drown you in information, but to point out and try and encourage you to have confidence when any of these sorts of data privacy roadblocks come up. You might think it's ridiculous, the issues and struggles you sometimes have accessing or having someone else access data on your behalf. But that's because it is slightly ridiculous, and that isn't really how the law is supposed to be working here. The final point to make in terms of access and data issues is that you can provide consent verbally. So it is always perfectly acceptable if you're on the phone call to a company or a financial institution to say something like, I wish to have my partner talk to you about this matter, and I'm giving verbal consent for them to access my data and handing over the phone now. It doesn't necessarily have to be in writing, and that's something which often I think smaller companies, which maybe have less of a sophisticated data protection understanding, don't always realise. Now, the second and third points up on this slide in terms of problem solving are about knowing your rights and understanding the systems. And a few great resources here, which are mentioned as well later in the presentation, are Which and Money Helper. But it's important if you are in a dispute, whether it's with a financial services company or a bank, that you do have a basic understanding of your rights. And those are everything from the rights you get under the Consumer Rights Act, not to be sold products or services which aren't fit for purpose, through to your rights in the financial services sphere. And that is, for example, to be sold products which are appropriate to you and to be given information which is fair, clear, and not misleading. And we'll cover off a few more resources where you can get more information on your rights in just a second. The second point I make here is understanding the systems. What I mean in this is, firstly, when confronting obstacles, it's very easy to see a bank or even a large online store as just one large black box. In reality, of course, you're dealing with another human being at the end of the phone who may have very little knowledge of dementia, and indeed, may know less about data protection or consumer rights than you do. And often their biggest worry in these cases will be accidentally disclosing your data to a fraudster. And I mention this for two reasons. Firstly, I think if you try and put yourself in the position of the other person on the phone line, it's perhaps a little bit easier to try and deal with what can often be incredibly frustrating and draining encounters. And secondly, I think if you can understand the systems, then even if you can't quite use them to your advantage, you can often use them to resolve disputes as efficiently as possible. So firstly, it's always worth flagging that and understanding that in many cases, a frontline call handler may not have the authority to settle a dispute, particularly if it's complex or higher value. And some literally have a monetary limit on in terms of amounts they can't go above in trying to resolve customer problems or complaints. So do try and figure out that earlier on, figure out if the person you're speaking to actually has authority to help you to the extent you need. And if not, save your firepower for talking to the person who can. Secondly, and this is very much linked to knowing your rights, speak their language if you can. There are certain words and phrases which are good at communicating you know your rights and you know the score, and can often help your complaint be treated a bit more seriously. So, for example, reminding the individual that their company has a duty to make reasonable adjustments, or reminding a firm that they'd have to deal appropriately with a potentially vulnerable customer can often show a sort of set prick up ears, for example, in organizations, and help ensure that your complaint is taken more seriously. And finally, one of the most powerful things you can sometimes do if you're running into difficulties is remind companies of their own policies or public statements. So again, an awful lot of the large banks, and I took a look at quite a lot of their websites before this webinar, have public statements around disability and accessibility and make certain promises and commitments. And it can be, very powerful if you're having difficulties with one of those institutions to remind them of that, as no employee is going to want to have a matter escalated on the basis that they failed to comply with the company's own disability commitments. Finally, in terms of understanding systems and resolving disputes, it's always important to remember you're dealing with a commercial party. A lot of these issues, if they crop up, the most valuable resource, I think, following a dementia diagnosis is time. And the last thing you do want to be doing is having to get into arguments or resolving difficulties. But these are commercial parties, and keeping your arguments simple and factual hopefully helps you keep your own temperature down a bit, and hopefully helps get the dispute resolved as simply and quickly as possible. We'll come on to in a minute as well about escalating your complaints to an ombudsman, but often it's important to remember that what companies are most worried about is whether or not it will cost more money to deal with your complaint than just resolving it properly in the first place. And with that, Catherine, can we pop on to the next slide? Yes, and in terms of managing your time and trying to resolve issues as quickly as possible, I flagged up a few very useful resources on this slide. So firstly, as I said, it's increasingly common for banks to actually be trying to offer specific resources or accessibility hubs for individuals, not just those with dementia or early onset diagnoses, but more generally. And it's really worth having a proper look at your bank's website to see what's on offer. Some, for example, offer specialist advisors who you can deal directly with. I also mention Money Saving Expert. That's a fantastic resource from Martin Lewis, who you may well have seen on the television. And that's not just a good resource for money saving tips, but it's also very useful for getting a sense of what other companies, other than the one you work with, do. And the forums on Money Saving Expert are full of quite useful real life examples, which obviously the guidance from Young Dementia or Alzheimer's Society just doesn't have the time to get into. Citizens Advice, again, this is a hugely useful resource, and in particular their Consumer Direct helpline is fantastically helpful if you run into any difficulties or disputes in the non-financial services kind of products and services sector. They're also the people to get in touch with and give a ring for issues you would have previously raised to trading standards. So, for example, if you're sold a product aggressively or under pressure, or that you simply don't need and want to take advantage of a cooling off period, which I'll come to in a moment. Which, again, is a great general resource and has some particularly useful guidance on cooling off periods, which I'll come to in just a second. Money Helper I've mentioned before, and this combines the government's old money advice service as well as PensionWise. It has loads of general advice, but what's particularly useful is that it has a range of template letters for all sorts of different disputes and issues. They're in a form of a letter, but you could also just easily adapt them to the format of an email. Lastly, but perhaps best, is Resolver. This is an online complaints tool, which is incredibly useful. Again, it provides templates and draft wording, but it also points you in precisely the right direction of which part of a huge range of companies, the specific contact point you should complain to, and allows you to keep all your correspondence in one place and even set reminders for you to chase things up. As often, I think sometimes dealing with or trying to resolve issues, sometimes the hardest thing is just losing momentum or losing track of correspondence. Finally, I mentioned escalation. You'll normally need to go through a company or a firm's internal complaint procedures first. And as I said, the best way to approach those if issues do arise is to keep them, keep your communications short, clear, and as emotionless as possible. And that's why using templates is quite so helpful. There's two good reasons to do that. Firstly, you don't want to allow yourself to get wound up. And secondly, if the issue does go on to an ombudsman, it's incredibly powerful to be coming across as the reasonable party, even if, and that show that you're staying respectful, even under very difficult personal circumstances. That can be really impressive, particularly if you're dealing with an organisation which has been rigid and inflexible in adapting to the needs of someone with dementia. Finally, I just wanted to mention the Ombudsman services. These are the independent bodies which resolve complaints and disputes for specific industries. The idea is that they offer a quick, although unfortunately they're under high demand, so I probably don't think we can quite say quick, but they offer, in theory, a quick and certainly free and independent alternative to having to go to court if you do have a dispute with a bank or a company that you can't resolve. The most important ombudsman I'd flag to you today are for financial services, the Financial Ombudsman Service, and more generally what's called the Ombudsman Services. The latter covers a range of services, including utilities, phone, internet, and gas. There's also a specific furniture and home improvement ombudsman, which a lot of companies are covered by, and that may be particularly useful if you encounter unsatisfactory products or services when adapting a home for dementia needs, for instance. Importantly, an ombudsman is trying to get to an outcome which is fair and reasonable in all the circumstances of the case. And so that might mean that even if you've been tripped up slightly by the sort of detailed terms and conditions, in the context of a person dealing with a dementia diagnosis, what's fair and reasonable might be quite different. And actually, in a majority of cases, the Ombudsman does tend to side or decide in favour of the consumer. So they can be an incredibly useful resource as well. Catherine, can we go on to the next slide? Great, thanks. So the final topic today is protect, and this covers not just classic scams where you are defrauded and someone tries to take your money, but also more generally other situations where you might be missold something that you don't need, or have your money put into a product for which the risks weren't properly explained. It should be said there's always going to be a difficult balance here between protecting yourself or your loved one or the person you're caring for versus limiting your or their own financial and personal autonomy, and the balance will be difficult. And certainly we found with my mum, we wanted her to have a bank card as long as possible, but one day she went into the bank and rather than withdrawing a couple of £100, managed to withdraw several thousand, and we're still not sure how she did that. But the point is there was always going to be a difficult balance to be struck here between independence on the one hand and vulnerability on the other. On that point, the first thing, and particularly under data security, is that prevention is often better than cure. Password security, it's difficult for all of us to remember our passwords, but it may be particularly worth considering using an online tool called a password manager if you're still planning to keep a significant number of accounts. as that helps you have a range of different passwords, not just the dog's name with a couple of numbers varied after the end. But the password managers are online tools which help you keep a range of passwords safe and available for when you need them. The other point is always worth looking at is consider what information is available about you online. A lot of push payment scams, which I'll mention in a moment, and sophisticated scams now try to use information about you that's accessible online in order to spoof, as it's called, or replicate a communication from someone you know, when in fact it's actually a malicious third party. The other thing is considering what you can do to actually stop either yourself or a loved one falling victim to or receiving large numbers of unsolicited offers. So some classic older methods, of course, are in terms of unsolicited calls, the telephone preference service. There is also a mail preference service, but the key thing with the telephone preference service, TPS, is that companies are supposed to screen against it every month. And it may give you quite a strong argument if someone does call you or your loved one, and a contract is entered into or a service or product is sold, and you later want to cancel that. Again, you can get no cold calling stickers from most local authorities to stick in the window of your home to attract in-person cold callers. Online, it may be worth exploring website blockers. You can either block specific websites or categories of websites, or even if there's really only a finite number of websites you're likely to want to use, consider setting up what's called a whitelist, which only lets you authorize specific websites. Again, these will all be things you need to discuss between yourself and a loved one as to what is right for you at any given point in the dementia journey, but they may help stop the other sort of what can often feel like a flood of unsolicited offers. And certainly I saw my mum getting plenty of emails at points which were very hard to tell apart from the real thing. Conscious of the time, so I'll just mention a couple of things very quickly. One of the things to flag are what are called authorized push payment scams. And these are scams where a third party attempts to trick you into making a transfer from your bank account. Some of the ones which have been particularly common in coronavirus times are individuals pretend to be a courier company requiring an extra payment to deliver a good. And we're also seeing increasingly energy supplier switching scams, with a number of energy companies going bust. Some messages pretend to be your current or a new energy company, and again are seeking your bank details when of course they plan to use them maliciously. The key point to flag here, if you are other than checking carefully who you're dealing with, is that there is now an industry code if you do fall victim to these types of scams, where previously there wasn't. And banks are required, and payment providers are required to consider what was reasonable for you to have done in all the circumstances. And they have to give particular regard if you are a vulnerable individual. So I think that's all to say, even if something like that happens and you have transferred money from your account, it's absolutely worth contacting a bank immediately, as well as action fraud details for which are on a subsequent slide, and seeing as you may well be able to recover the money. Catherine, can we go on to the next slide? Thanks. I think there's one more after it, actually, which we might want to jump to. Yeah, that's the final point is outside of authorized scams, there's also a lot of concern these days about pensions and investment scams. And on this front, I particularly direct you to the FCA's Scams Smart website, which you can find on Google. And that lists a lot of the warning signs to be aware of in terms of pensions and financial products. Probably the most important risk factor I'd flag is unsolicited, unexpected offers. most reputable financial companies will not approach you in that way. So that's a major red flag. And the website has an awful lot of other ones. In addition, just because you find a financial product or service on a search engine or social media doesn't mean it's regulated. What you want to do is use the FCA register, and there'll be a link to that in the email afterwards, to check if the firm or the financial advisor you're speaking to is authorized, and you shouldn't deal with them if they're not. Again, a key aspect and another risk factor is often scammers try to rush or pressure individuals into decisions. The answer here is that again, that's a risk factor, and you never should feel rushed or pressured into using or buying a financial service. And finally, the advice is always to seek advice either from a professional, from loved ones as well, and indeed from various dementia services. The final point there was just unauthorized payments. We mentioned what happens if you've accidentally authorized a payment from your account, but as you are probably all aware, the position if there are unauthorized payments from your account, i.e. you don't quite know why they've happened, say for example you've been the victim of identity theft, that's incredibly simple. Your bank or financial institution is required to reimburse you for those. I think the previous slide also had a couple of resources just to flag, and I think the emphasis is that don't want this to sound doom and gloom. Many people don't encounter these types of issues, but if you do, you can help yourself and others by obviously contacting your bank immediately, and also contacting the appropriate body, whether that's Action Forward for a scam, or if you've been unsatisfied or have concerns over a financial product, the Financial Conduct Authority's Consumer Helpline. I think those were all the points. I really want to leave a little bit of time for questions for Kenny and I, but hopefully that's some useful information on planning, problem solving and protecting. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully that will give you a little bit of extra ammunition if any issues do arise.
Calum, thank you very much for that. That was really useful information. Hi, everybody. I've been in the background just helping Calum. Calum, we haven't had any questions come through at the moment. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to ask Kenny. If there's any other comments from Kenny?
I think for me the important thing is the independence versus vulnerability question. Mm-hmm. I fully understand that people want to protect me and look after me, but at the same time I want to be independent, and sometimes that can, it doesn't sit comfortably. So that for me is an important consideration. I'm very fortunate. I've not encountered any of the issues that Calum spoke through. I'm very fortunate in that regard. I'm very fortunate to have people round about me who look out for me, and who deal with things for me if it's required. The biggest issue for me in the last year, my partner had to become my father's power of attorney. When my father died and my partner went to the bank, we hadn't lodged the power of attorney in time. And the power of attorney dies when the individual dies. So we faced some difficulties in managing my father's banking arrangements after his death. So I would just urge everyone, if you have power of attorney, lodge it with I don't know if Calum, if that's the right thing to advise people to do, but lodge it as quickly as you can with any banks or other institutions that you're involved with.
Yes, Kenny, absolutely right. I think getting your power of attorney in order, and for a lot of institutions, they have their own processes for accepting it. That's absolutely right. So yes, it's sort of almost never too early. Yeah.
One question, Calum, is is it possible for banks to do things like setting spending limits on debit cards, so that if there is a transaction that's, you know, thousands of pounds, like somebody comes in to try and withdraw that amount of money, there's an alert that says, you know, this shouldn't be happening for this person? Or is it possible to ask banks to do that kind of thing?
Yeah, Catherine, I think it will really vary from bank to bank what sort of service they're willing to offer. Certainly, you can have a discussion and can ask your bank for a credit card to reduce a credit limit. Absolutely. Obviously, the debit card, the limit is largely what's in the account. Otherwise, what extra services, if you like, are on offer will vary from bank to bank. I know some banks, for example, Barclays, you can actually set from it's a fairly limited list, but there's a certain list of types of products or services. You can actually sort of block expenditure related to those from being put on your card. So, I mean, one that jumps to mind is sort of certain types of websites and gambling. And that might be, you know, it's not going to cover everything, but that might be one type of option for the future.
Just see if a question has come through here. So just a question here. Do you think overall solicitors know the importance of LPA for health? They've had experience of someone who was telling them it wasn't necessary.
I have to say the health and welfare, LPA isn't my particular area of expertise, so I don't want to give too much advice here. I mean, I think that sounds like quite a surprising statement. I think I definitely, you know, seek advice as well from specialist dementia services on that front, not just a solicitor who may or may not have you know, detailed knowledge of dementia.
Yeah, and a comment's just come through to say you can request to have a normal debit card and remove the contactless, reduce the contactless limit, or remove the contactless aspect altogether, which is possible. But then, of course, you have an issue with making sure the PIN is remembered and the card doesn't get blocked with multiple attempts to put in a PIN number that's not correct. So yes, there's a comment that's come through there that you can take that off. Okay, I think that's all our questions that have come through.
I think it's probably over to me now then to say thank you so much, Calum and Kenny. You absolutely packed that full of really practical information. It was so clearly delivered as well, and I think it was made even more valuable by that personal experience from the both of you. So thank you very much for that. As you mentioned, Calum, the follow-up email will include all the links to all the useful resources and services that you've mentioned. And we'll also, of course, link to the recording of the webinar. There's all sorts, I think, on these slides that are going to be really useful for people. Thank you very much for everyone who's attended. We're taking a break during December, but we'll be back full of vim and vigor January 19th, 2:30, and we'll obviously be letting you know the topic for January as soon as we can. Until then, it's way too early to say have a happy festive period, so I dare not. But anyway, keep well and look after yourselves. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.